Kahn is the Andreas Dracopoulos Director of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics and the Levy Professors of Bioethics and Public Policy. He is also a professor in the Departments of Health Policy and Management in the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. His research interest includes the ethics of research, ethics and public health, and ethics and emerging biomedical technologies. He speaks widely, both in the US and abroad, and has published 4 books and over 130 articles. And he is currently co-principal investigator for the Johns Hopkins Center of Excellence in Ethics and Policy Research on Genomics and Infectious Disease. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and fellows of the Hastings Centers, and has chaired or served on committees and panel for the National Institute of Health, the Center of Disease Control, and the National Academy of Medicine. His education includes a BA in microbiology, MPH, and PhD in philosophy. Jeffrey, it's a great honor to welcome you. It's a privilege to having you here for Imagination Week. As we've discussed, the floor is yours for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to the question, because the last couple of conference, actually, students, they have a lot of questions, so it's important to let them ask you some questions. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Xavier. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And let me add my welcome to you all. It's morning here. Good morning from the East Coast of the United States. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe. And I guess good evening to you, Xavier, in Singapore. So I'm going to talk about a scientific topic, but really focusing on the governance issues and the ethical issues that go into thinking about that governance. And I want to just focus for 1 minute on the slide here at the title, where I have included the term designing our shared future. So really, this is about how we think about governance of emerging biomedical technologies that raise some really interesting and important ethical issues that affect us all. So it's not just about individuals, but really deciding on behalf of the collective. Okay, let me make sure my computer, here we go. So this is a PDF of an old article, a little bit blurry because it's the best copy available digitally of a journal article from Science magazine, very famous journal in the English-speaking scientific publication world from June 1975. Why am I showing you this? It's because there have been efforts to think about how to responsibly govern emerging genetic technologies for a very long time. That's the point here. So this is, in my world, a quite famous article authored by a number of people who would become Nobel Prize winners, who were announcing on behalf of the scientific community to which they belonged that they wanted to go forward with a brand new DNA technology, a genetic technology that allowed the modification of genes inside of the cells of living organisms in a very early and unknown way in the mid-1970s. And they were announcing that they thought as a scientific community, they ought to go forward responsibly. And that way it would be something that the scientific community would be able to control and steer, rather than wait for governments of the countries in which these scientists worked would impose restrictions on them. It's important to say that the scientists who authored this article and who were at the conference that produced this article, which was called the Asilomar Conference for a conference center near Santa Barbara, California in the US, all the scientists were from the United States or the United Kingdom. So this was a technology that was really under the control of the scientific community in 2 places, really just a few laboratories in the United States and in the UK. That's an important feature of the history. So that's 1975. That's one bookend. Here we are, right, in 2021, quite a number of years later, almost 50 years later. So that was governance and thinking about governance in the 20th century. Here we are in the 21st century, 20 years into the 21st century. What's different? So one thing that's quite different is that science is not so controlled by a few people in a few places. It's far more democratic, and I don't mean that in the political sense of democracy, but rather across numbers of places, numbers of people. It doesn't cost as much as it used to. It's not an environment that a single country or even a small number of countries can assert or exert their leadership. So it doesn't require much expertise. The laboratories are not so specialized that would do this work as it was in 1975. The tools that are required to do things like genome editing using CRISPR technology, an acronym for a gene editing tool, are much more available even to high school biology students, and you can buy them on platforms like Amazon if you want to buy a kit to do genome editing at home. So it's a very different environment. The implications of that are that self-policing, like the example of the Asilomar conference indicates, just isn't possible anymore, right? There aren't mechanisms where the scientific community of a few people can say, we will be responsible in the following way and exert their leadership, because we've got such a diffuse environment in which the technologies are being used. There just isn't the concentration of expertise and leadership that there was in the past. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's arguably a good thing that there's so much more ability to do important science, but it makes governance a bigger challenge. So that's the takeaway here. So the question that I want to talk about for the remaining 35 minutes with you before we move to Q&A, and then I talked with Xavier about, is what should we imagine and can we expect, and I would say actually hope, what do we want the landscape to look like for the governance of emerging biotechnologies like human genome editing over the next few decades, right? Next decade and beyond is a little hard to predict beyond 10 years, but let's try to imagine a 30-year future. What does the world look like in 2050 in relation to some of these technologies, and how do we get there? Okay, so I want to do a little bit of background science with you, and this is not human genome editing. This is something that's actually being used in humans that's a lot like genome editing, but not quite genome editing, and I'm going to talk about that just for a really short time because I think it's a helpful example for what will happen when these technologies become available. So this is a technology called mitochondrial replacement, MRT, as it says here. And the question to the international community was, when is it ethical to begin a trial, a human trial, a clinical trial of this technology to make a baby this way, as you'll see in a second, and then what oversight or follow-up governance really is necessary to responsibly do it. So those are the questions, and that question was posed to a committee that I chaired, but it was on the kind of international stage starting in really 2014 into 2015. So not so long ago, but it gives us a little bit of a taste of where we're headed with gene editing tools. So here's a cartoon, obviously, of what this technology is like, and the important thing to take away here, and hopefully you can see my cursor, I think you can. There are two eggs here. The egg here on the bottom is from a woman who has mitochondria, which are the power plants, the batteries inside of a cell that carry a little bit of DNA like all mitochondria do, but hers are disease causing. And so all of the babies born from her eggs will have the disease caused by these faulty, these genetically disease causing mitochondria. And so the only way for her to have a genetically related baby is for her to have an egg from a donor, a stranger, or a sister or somebody in her family, and have the nucleus. This is the DNA inside of the center of the cell. Think of it like the egg of the yellow part of a chicken egg is removed from her egg. The part that is disease causing is left behind, and it is put into the white part where the yellow part is removed from the donor egg, and her yellow part is put into the donor white part. Okay, and a new egg is created, and then it is fertilized by a sperm through a pipette. A single sperm is injected, and you get a developing human embryo. So you've got what some people have called an embryo with 3 parents, or at least 3 people contributing their genetic makeup to it. So 2 women, right? You've got woman 1 here, woman 2 here. This woman's mitochondria, this woman's nuclear DNA, and then the sperm from 1 man, and together they make up 1 embryo. It's not like in vitro fertilization where you've got what happens in nature just happening in a petri dish, right? 1 egg is is fertilized by one sperm, but this is different. You've made something that nature cannot make. And so the question is this acceptable to do at all? And if so, how do we begin to do it? And what would the proper governance and oversight look like? Okay, so it turns out there was a lot of talk about this and about how to control it and how to make sure we didn't do it without proper government oversight. And a report that I'm going to show you in a second was issued in late 2015, but then in September of 2016, it was announced that a baby had already been born using this technique. And the reason I'm showing you this is because one, it happened without the proper oversight, at least the oversight that was recommended by the commissions and committees across the US, the UK, other European countries that were talking about how to do it responsibly. It went forward without any of that because somebody knew how to do it and was able to get a patient who was agreeable. Now, the thing that makes this an important story is that it happened in Mexico. So this is a originally Chinese national physician who still operates a fertility clinic in New York City in the US, who opened a satellite clinic in Guadalajara, Mexico to do this technology. So why all that? Because it was made illegal in the US by our Food and Drug Administration. So the same agency that oversees the vaccine that's being developed against COVID, also controls all sorts of things, of course, including these kinds of technologies. And they said, you may not do this technology until it's gone through the proper controls. In fact, it was prohibited by our Congress right around the time that this baby was born. So this guy, John Zhang is his name, opened a clinic, a satellite clinic of his clinic from New York in Mexico so that he could avoid the controls that would be placed on him if he did it in the United States. So as it says here, there are two methods. I showed you just one of them, but more or less the same. Neither had been approved in the US. So Zhang went to Mexico instead, where he says, quote, there are no rules. So he did this in a way to subvert the governance that had been put in place very early. I'm showing you this because it's, I think, a kind of red flag, a kind of wake up to what happens when there are new technologies that come along and people are able to use them without a lot of specialized training or skill required. Okay, so MRT is one example. I've been very quick because I want to make sure we have enough time to get through all these slides. MRT is one technology, human genome editing, so that's HGE, is another, and they both raise some ethical issues in common. Here's the report that I mentioned that I worked on related to mitochondrial replacement. You can look it up if you're interested. It's National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, 2015. So what matters here from an ethics perspective? One issue that these technologies share is that they are technologies that modify the germ cells, that is the eggs or the sperm of the individual, and therefore the germ line. So the distinction here is when you do genetic modification on cells in somebody's body, if you were to do genetic modification on the cells in my body that were my muscle cells, it would change my muscle cells, but it wouldn't change the sperm in my body, so that when I have children, the change in my muscle cells would not be passed on to those children. But if you change the sperm cells in my body or the egg cells in my wife with the same kind of technology, those changes would be passed on to our children. And that means we've changed the germ line. The germ line are the cells that are the egg and sperm. Okay, and they're passed on to future generations. And so if you change the cells in my sperm that therefore change the cells or affect the cells in my children, my children's children will also be affected, and so on, right? It just goes off into the future infinitely. So changing the germline has implications that changing cells that die with me does not have. That's issue number one. Why is that a problem? Well, we don't know whether it's safe. So if we introduce changes in the germline that get passed on to future generations and it isn't safe, we've unleashed an unsafe change into societies, into the human genome in ways that we can't control. It's like the genie's out of the bottle. That's one big problem. We have to be sure that it's safe enough to do that when we change it and it's passed on to future generations, that that's an acceptable, responsible thing to do. The second, it's a little harder. Not everybody agrees with this, but it somehow feels unnatural in a way that is unacceptable. And some people have called this problem the problem of playing God. Humans shouldn't change things that are permanent and future facing and will affect all future generations in ways that seem to be reserved only for powers that are bigger than us, right? It's just not responsible to unleash changes like this on all the future, and that we should be more humble about what we as humans should be doing to ourselves and to especially the future population on our planet. The third is that when you make changes like this and you've done it for a particular reason, you're saying something, you're making a statement about the reasons that you're changing the individual. So you're saying that the person who would be born with these genetic diseases that we're trying to fix somehow don't deserve to exist, right? And that therefore the people who do exist with those diseases or disabilities somehow are less worthy. And so it's a kind of problem of eugenics, and we have to be careful about the social messages that we're sending by the use of these technologies. So I've given you a sort of quick snapshot about why these are ethical issues, and so the governance needs to kind of follow on these concerns. Like how do we govern carefully and responsibly that takes account of these kinds of ethics concerns? In answer to that question, another report, again by the US National Academies, but this was an international report, tried to take on the answer to the question for how to responsibly use these technologies for humans, the human genome editing tools, CRISPR and the like. And this report was published in 2017, actually on Valentine's Day here in the US, February 14th, a memorable day. And we said a few things, right? That the governance needs to properly balance ethics and these governance concerns. And I'll let you read this. I won't talk about each of them because I want to make sure we make our way through here, but it really focuses on protection and safety of the children who would be born by using these technologies. So if we were to use MRT or these genome editing tools in ways that modify human embryos or modify the sperm and or the eggs that make up a human embryo such that the child that was born from it would have these changes introduced, we have to do them in ways that minimize risk to the children who are born. We have to know that they work, that they're safe, and we want to control the adverse effects to the generations that come, right? So part of the challenge in all that is we can, in the US or in France or in Singapore, wherever you may be sitting, can make rules like this, but that doesn't mean that that other places in the world will follow the rules that are made in our countries. So what do we do about cross-border issues? When we have examples like Dr. Zhang, who will open a clinic in Mexico because that's a way for him to avoid the rules that apply in the country where he lives and mostly works in the US. What do we do about that? And as it says here, emerging problems of reproductive technology tourism. Sorry for that shorthand there. So here was the answer to that question. And again, won't go through all of this, but again, I point you to it. If you're interested, you can look this up, but there's a long list of things that would need to happen in terms of how we would responsibly go forward internationally. So each country would pay attention to these principles and these categories of responsible use, or how to do responsibly the things in these categories that are listed, which would include, don't do things that are not to fix disease, remove harm, and don't engage in enhancing individuals. Don't try to make them smarter, stronger, taller, faster. Focus on the things that are about disease that cause people to have serious illness or even death, and make sure you engage the public. Okay, so these are all kind of, in some sense, hortatory kinds of recommendations. These are the things you should do, but reports like these don't have the force of policy or law. One last thing, because it's important for what's going to come next, is we spent a lot of time in this report. I was on this committee as well, as you probably can tell by the way I'm talking, about what it would take to use these tools in ways that would modify human embryos and therefore modify people in ways that their germ lines would be changed and the changes would be passed on to future generations. So there are 10 things on this list, a long list. Each of them would have to be checked off. Think of it as a checklist before you could go forward for the first time in using this technology, these tools to change human embryos in ways that would result in a born child. Okay, it's a long list, and we all thought this list could not possibly be satisfied anytime in the near term. This is like a 10-year scientific undertaking of a lot of work and a lot of luck to get to the point where you could check all of these boxes, these circles here, and know that you could go forward for the very first time with humans. Okay, I'm obviously signaling where we're headed. So this was, we thought, a kind of, all right, this is a very controversial area. There could be a path forward, but it's going to be a long time, painstaking, a lot of science, a lot of oversight, a lot of review in the scientific literature. And so, let's engage in this in a responsible, careful way over a period of time. But some challenges with approaches like this, I've already kind of mentioned some. One is that when you start to announce principles and make recommendations, that is not governance. Now, governance is policy and law. And if it's international, it has to be things like treaties. And so that's hard policy, hard governance, right? Where we make laws that say you may not do this or you may do that. And here are the rules, restrictions, parameters under which you can. And then there's soft governments, incentives about how we make sure people behave in ways we hope they will. So for instance, if you want to publish in the biomedical literature, by and large, you have to follow certain rules. You can't falsify data. You have to give authorship to the people who are legitimate authors and not to people who, just want their name published. You have to follow certain rules related to how you use animals in research, how you use humans in research. And so we have ways of requiring people to follow what look like governance, but they're not sort of by law or policy, they're more soft. So that's the distinction here I'm trying to draw. And when you want to translate governance, right, into actual recommendations and guidance into policy, it requires taking some principles and saying, well, in our culture, in our society, these principles are more important than others. So in the US, where I live and where I was born and raised, we care a lot about individual freedom. I'm sure you know that from either your experience or having read about us. So, we care very much about individuals getting to decide for themselves. But in other countries, I don't know if any of you are living in China or from China, that isn't so true in China. In China, it's much more important to think about the collective, the good of the society and the whole. And so different principles are therefore prioritized, which will lead to different kinds of governance or different answers to the question about governance. How does governance look? And so you get significant, as it says here, significant differences in governance informed by exactly the same set of principles. They're just prioritized or emphasized in a different way. Okay, that's all I want to say about this. All right, so in the shadow, really, of the release of this report and a lot of discussion that came about these kinds of challenges was an international summit. It was the second in a series of international summits related to how humans should use these genome editing tools on humans. So the report that I mentioned was issued in February of 2017, and then in November of 2018, the second international summit on the use of genome editing in humans was held in Hong Kong. And you may know, you may remember, a very big splash announcement was made at this conference by this guy, Dr. J.K. He, Zhangque He, who is a Chinese physician and researcher who announced just as this meeting was getting underway that he had successfully modified human embryos, implanted them in women, and that one set of twins had been successfully born. So a big shock, right? So a lot of this discussion has been going on. We shouldn't go forward except under these very strict rules. Yeah, we understand that different countries will have to make different judgments about governance, but there are some standard scientific steps that are going to have to be taken before we go forward. And then he announced he'd already done it, much to the surprise and chagrin of the world community. And we all happened to be convened there for this meeting. And so it was a kind of opportune moment for him to make a big splash. He thought he would get a lot of accolades and congratulations, but it was not the way people around the world reacted. It was uniform, universal, negative reaction and condemnation for what he did. To give you a sense, I'm sitting, here's my cursor again, I'm sitting somewhere over here. Everybody was sitting there with their their smartphones taking pictures of this moment because it felt very historic. And the slides that were shown that day actually never were shown again. So anybody who took photographs of the slides as they were being shown have for posterity something kind of special, because to this day, the results of his research nor these slides have ever been published. So this was a kind of big moment in science. It's a little bit of the opposite of the Asilomar example, right? Where Asilomar was an announcement by the scientific community about how we're going to behave responsibly. This was the counter example. One guy who was a member of the scientific community, so not a charlatan, I'm sure you know that word, but a rogue scientist, somebody who knew what he was doing, but did it in a way that was against all of the announced responsible approaches that the scientific community had signed on to. So what do we do about that? So this became known by a lot of different things. The CRISPR baby scandal is one that's sort of self-descriptive. And as this article, the screenshot shows, this was published in March of 2019. So these photographs were November of 2018. This article was from March of 2019. And so I want to now spend a few minutes talking about sort of what do we take away from this story? And what questions do we need to have answered, and have we answered in ways that would inform this question about governance, right? And I think really important, the subtitle here about this fast moving field. It's incredibly fast moving. It's very hard to keep up with the science, been obviously overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but the science still continues, and there's still a lot of governance discussion happening and a lot of concerns about what to do about this fast moving field. So why does it matter? It's probably pretty obvious, but let me ask a few questions. So one, what happened to Dr. He and to the more important, to the children? So we don't actually know what happened to the children yet. I'm going to say something about that in a second. What was interesting is the world community was uniformly negative and very outspokenly negative about what Dr. He had done and the way he had done it and the secrecy under which he had done it. What was interesting was the Chinese government really was quiet, silent for a number of weeks. I think fair to say now, waiting to see what the world reaction would be, because I think it's fair to say now that Dr. He really believed he would get a lot of positive accolades and be heralded as a kind of champion, a kind of breakthrough moment, and maybe a Nobel Prize would come. But instead, it was quite the opposite, and he may have been either, trying to convince the members of the Chinese government that he would actually be a hero, or maybe they thought he would be a hero and tried to convince him. It's not clear, but there was a kind of waiting period before the Chinese government eventually reacted, and subsequently he was charged with crimes. And as far as we know, he's serving a prison sentence of, I think, 3 years was the public announcement, but who knows how long he will be out of the limelight and maybe imprisoned. So bad things happen to him. That story may never be told exactly about what happened and why, but bad things happen to him. The children still, actually nobody knows who they are. They were given sort of, false names to protect their identity. But by protecting their identity, there's no way to assess whether the technology actually did what Dr. He said it did, and what the health of those children are in ways that would inform future uses of this technology. So it's not great that there is still no access to these children, and there may never be. Maybe when they become older and they are willing to share, it's not clear when it will actually become known, but it's possible sometime in the future. There's an outstanding question, and this has sort of been answered, about what about the other scientists? So he didn't do this totally by himself. And among the things that are interesting about this story is he was a trainee here in the US. He did his PhD at Rice University in Houston, Texas, and he was a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University in California. So he had certainly training from others around the world. And there was some report that scientists from both those places actually helped him do what he said he did to create these genetically modified children. So what should happen to them? Because they weren't in China, so the Chinese authorities can't do anything to them, but what should happen to them in terms of their institutions, maybe the US government, the scientific community? And the answer so far has been nothing. There was an investigation at both Rice University and Stanford, but nothing happened to any of the researchers in either of those places. So it's an interesting problem, sort of like where does responsibility end when you have controversial and maybe unethical or law-breaking science happening, and we actually have to figure that out because it has yet to really be figured out. There's a strong concern, and among, I think, the reasons that the scientific community was so outspoken against what Dr. He did is that they worried about the implications for other research, that this shows the irresponsibility of science and scientists. And until we can make sure that they will behave responsibly, we, governments around the world, should impose prohibitions. And I have spoken publicly and before the Congress of our country here in the US that I believe prohibitions are a really bad idea because they encourage people like Dr. Zhang to go to places like Mexico. So prohibitions just drive people to places where there are no controls. That's not a good way for science to proceed responsibly. I think strict controls allow science to proceed responsibly and maybe take some risks that would not be possible were things totally open, and certainly not if things are prohibited. So I think the scientific community is sort of right about this, where they say, we don't want prohibitions to be implemented because of one bad actor. I agree, that's bad policy. And so we all wonder when and where there will be other examples. So Dr. He said that he had implanted embryos into more than the one woman who had the twins. Nobody knows whether other babies were born. By this point, they would have been born if they were, but that's not known. And so, Dr. He's work is probably not going to happen anytime soon anymore, if it ever does. But what about around the rest of the world? And so everybody's sort of waiting on pins and needles, like who's going to be next, under what circumstances, and where. So I think that's a very open question. And what to do about it, of course, is a really important matter. And that's a little bit what's now next in my slides. So as all of this stuff was happening in China, one geneticist in Russia said, I have talked with Dr. He. I now have the recipe, as he called it, the protocol about how to do this. And my clinic is open for business for anybody who wants me to do genetic modification on embryos for them and make children with whatever genetic modifications they desire. Come to Moscow. And so the world said, the world community reacted like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we feared. It won't take much for one, or two or three rogue actors to really unleash this in a way that it will be uncontrollable, because there will be a kind of rush to satisfy demand. It becomes kind of like a market-driven problem. So gene-edited babies become a thing, and we don't have a way to control it. And this Russian scientist said, I'm going to be the person to pick up where Dr. He left off. It turns out that the Russian government put a kibosh on that somewhat publicly, a little bit behind the scenes. And so it has not happened, but not clear that, okay, it's not going to be Russia, at least not now, but where else could it be? Still remains an open question. So again, in the aftermath of all this came two more committees and commissions, one by the World Health Organization, the WHO, which is still doing its work. So this is sort of immediately after the announcement in November of 2018. So early in 2019 came an announcement that this commission would be formed. Here we are now, early 2021. They still have not finished their work. They expect to, I'm told, sometime in the first quarter. So that's between now and say end of March of 2021. And we'll see what they have to say. I was appointed to this commission, which was announced around the same time, a joint international commission between the national academies in the US and the Royal Society in the UK, but a very international group from across many countries, including Europe, Africa, the Asian continent, US, so really wide-ranging. And so we issued our report in the fall, so just in September of 2020. Here's its cover, you can look it up. And we said a few things about how this should go forward with a lot more meat on the bones related to the governance of this technology across international conditions. So we said countries are going to have to decide this for themselves, but there needs to be transparency, there needs to be evaluation case by case, and it needs to be done with international input. Sorry for the, I'll share these slides with you so you can get all this detail if you want it. But there needs to be an international body set up to inform how countries make these decisions, right? So that's a sort of new thing here. And then the other thing to take away here is we said there needs to be a mechanism for raising concerns about research. That's the whistleblowing function, the thing that didn't exist and still doesn't, where people might have known that people like Dr. He were engaged in unethical, maybe illegal science, but didn't know what to do about it. Who should they tell? And so we said there needs to be a mechanism set up to manage that. All right, last few slides, and then we'll open it for your comments and questions. So what's next is a really important question, of course, and I want to now look a little future forward. As I said, the report from the World Health Organization Committee is pending. It'll come out in sometime before the spring. We don't know what will happen in response to the report that I was part of. Probably not much until the WHO committee issues its report, and there will be a kind of attempt to harmonize the recommendations of our two reports. Some or all of the recommendations may be adopted. There may be an attempt, as I said, to harmonize. Some countries may go along, others may not. There will be some peer pressure, I presume, to follow, but it's not clear sort of how this will all unfold. Maybe there'll be more commissions. That's meant to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Part of what the takeaway from this slide set should be is we've had a lot of commissions that have discussed these issues, and it hasn't, at least yet, really helped to steer things in exactly the way we would hope. So we may see the status quo, which is a little bit of a free-for-all, a sort of laissez-faire situation and environment. But let's consider sort of what the next few decades might look like. So here's some possible futures. I want to do a little bit of scenario describing here and ask you, as part of our discussion Q&A, sort of what you think the most likely outcome will be. That's one, is a sort of, I want you to predict, but then I also want you to sort of tell me what you hope for. So one's a more descriptive question and the other's a more prescriptive question, like what do you want versus what do you think will actually happen? Okay, so one possible, there are four I'm going to share with you, four possible scenarios. One is that we have a kind of unregulated, Wild West, as we would say in the US, an unregulated frontier. So this is sort of laissez-faire, very few regulations. It's a free market. Let the economic levers do their thing. A greater tolerance for disruptive technologies. We have a lot of that already for high tech, and so maybe we just treat this kind of technology in the same way. And that would then create all sorts of incentives to be first to market. Who's going to be the Google or the Facebook of genome editing technologies? Lots of let people do what they want in their garages. So biohacking, buy your kits on Amazon, direct to consumer products like 23andMe, but for human genome editing, who knows, right? And we would have a pretty different set of scenarios country to country. And people would go to wherever they wanted to in terms of what was being offered and their perceived, the products, as it were, the safety of the perceived safety of the products, maybe that they get to combine a vacation with their services or whatever. It's a sort of, unregulated private sector dominates. Second possible scenario is one that I would say, I'll show my cards here. I hope we end up with something more like this. So we call this science in the public interest, where we have kind of a democratic, and that should be small d in terms of the meaning here, not democratic like a political party. Governance, it's a more open source technology. So the science is shared openly. We have regulatory regimes that govern it carefully. And so social values help us steer the direction in which this goes. The private sector and the public sector work together. So governments are always big engines of basic science. private sector picks up the fruits of basic science and turns them into products that we can all use. And that's sort of the model that we now have, but trying to do that in a way that there is cross-border harmonization. So that's what this last bullet is, where there's some kind of international commission or observatory that guides responsible introduction and eventual availability and use of these technologies across borders. So that's where I hope we end up. How we get there, of course, is very much an open question. Third possibility gets a little more sci-fi, I guess, where let's just imagine where, you know, there's a further consolidation of technology. And this is just another technology. It's a biomedical technology, but it gets combined with a data technology that's now sort of emerging, high tech, you know, internet technology, 23andMe technology, and we end up with a kind of monopolistic control of these technologies and the translational pathway that comes from it. So this becomes something that's much more in the private sector than in the public sector. Intellectual property is what is the thing that's worth anything, and it's controlled and licensed by the owners of it, which are these monopolistic entities, and that's who dictates access to the technologies. And so you end up getting these access and use of these technologies treated more as a luxury good than medicines. So that's, I think, less likely, but you can imagine that being a way this goes, at least in some jurisdictions. And then the last suggested possible outcome, and of course there could be hybrids of any of these, or maybe you can imagine others, that we have country level control. So country to country figure out how to do this, but they do this by themselves on their own without cooperation or very limited cooperation. So we get heavier regulation and oversight, but it's created country by country rather with any sense of harmonization. So you get quasi-nationalized direction of science, but governments figure out sort of where their niche is, what's the right areas for them to invest in for innovation and areas of excellence. And so then you get, you know, access to certain technologies in some places, but not in others. People, researchers go to the places where their expertise is most valued, and you get brain drain. So that happens already. It's a little bit like we experience already with some countries sending, you know, their science, seeing their science, their smartest people end up going to other places. Had a little bit of that in the United States, where some of our states were more permissive for things like embryonic stem cell research than others. So the scientists wanted to go to California and not be in places that were more restrictive. And so with that, you get this scenario, you get a very patchwork sense of the governance, very different in different places. And people then would go wherever they would find the things that they were after. So you get a real flourishing kind of medical tourism and a little bit of buyer beware. Okay, I think that that's the end. It is. Back to my question to you all. What sort of future do you hope for? And maybe, you know, what do you predict would be a likely outcome? Any of these four, something different than what I have very quickly outlined? And how do we get there? All right, interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you for being so attentive. And now I think we have the opportunity for some discussion and conversation. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you. That was very insightful, very interesting, a bit scary sometimes, but definitely interesting. I have a lot of questions, so if it's possible for you to make some short answer in order to cover maximum of questions. The first one, it's could you clarify a bit what's happened in China with Dr. He, Dr. He or Dr. He, I don't know how to pronounce, but what's happened with the public opinion, general opinions, global opinion, basically? Because as you said, that's or he will get the Nobel Prize or putting in jail. Unfortunately, he doesn't have the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
So what's happened? What is the opinion? What's happened exactly?
So it's a good question, and it's Dr. He, which is a little easier for us in English, because if his name were Dr. He, then we'd have a hard time saying he. It was very complicating for us actually to speak about his name. The answer, at least from the scientific community, was uniformly negative. Public opinion is harder to gauge, and of course, public opinion across different places was and is different. And so it was a little bit of a challenge to answer that question. It was really quite diverse. And I think there's some subset of people who think that he was quite a visionary, is quite a visionary, and deserves to be, congratulated, not to be put in jail. But I think the by and large, the world opinion, and certainly the scientific community's opinion across the borders of the world, has been uniformly negative. And the question, I think, is how much public opinion should matter. That's a really interesting question, and I don't have a good answer to that. Probably more than it has, I guess, is the one thing I would say. And I don't want to. I could talk a lot more about this, but I think you want to get to more questions.
There's a question about what do you think about person like Zosia Zener, self-CRISPR and his business to encourage people doing the same thing?
Sorry, I didn't get the first part.
Zosia Zener is the CEO and founder of Odin.
I'm not understanding the English.
Yeah,
sorry.
is the the biohacker.
Yeah.
He's
yes.
also
yes.
He's feathers on the Netflix and Natural Selection as well.
Yeah.
With you, Zosia. What do you think about what he's doing?
Gotcha. Joshua Zener. Sorry, I was not
connected.
Yeah, no,
sorry.
No, my fault. Yeah, it's really interesting. So this is a problem we haven't really confronted before, because medical technologies were just not available to people to use in their basements, right, or their garages, or whatever, their living rooms. And so it's a little hard to know what to say, except he's not doing anything that so far crosses the line. Like if you wanted to take whatever he's working on and sell it to other people, that would not be allowed in our country, because you would have to get approval from the FDA, right? The Food and Drug Administration, the authority. But if he just wants to do things to himself, or tell other people how to do things to themselves, they're so far permitted to do that. Do I think it's responsible? No, it isn't responsible. But that doesn't mean, and people do lots of things that aren't terribly responsible. I don't think it's that responsible to put a bungee cord on your ankle and jump off of a bridge head first, but people are allowed to do that. And so that's an interesting, right? We're treating a biomedical technology like bungee jumping. So is that a good or a bad idea? I don't think that's a great idea, but that's sort of where we are. And that's to me, biohacking represents. There's an interesting kind of hybrid version of this, which is if you go on the internet, the Broad Institute, MIT and Harvard, have a recipe for a do-it-yourself nasal vaccine against COVID-19. They're not selling it. They're not making it to offer to the public. They offer a recipe that you go online and you make yourself at home. You can buy all of the products from laboratory supply companies on the internet. And it's complicated to do, but if you have the right tools at home in a laboratory that's, makes sterile things, you can make a do-it-yourself vaccine that you spray into your nose. That to me is in a way worse than what Joshua Zener is doing, because now you're telling people how to do things that may actually be bad for them. I mean, Joshua Zener is sort of, entertaining, but he's not really causing any harm yet. And the things he's doing aren't really harmful to him or others. But when you're potentially trying to tell people how to make their own vaccines such that the real vaccine, the real approved vaccine, may not work, that doesn't seem like a good idea for individuals or for public health. So I think it's a pretty interesting area where we have people like Joshua Zener who aren't, really in the scientific community doing things. And then we've got real scientists who are acting in ways that are more like biohackers. And what to say about that feels to me actually more important and more urgent than the Joshua Zener example. And I hope that the unnatural selection folks, the guys who made those 4 episodes, will in their next, they want to do more, will take on this question. I've encouraged them to do so. I hope they do.
Thank you. It seems inevitable that eventually these technology will be used to enhance individuals, whether we implement regulations or not. So what measure will be taken when it's happened? Yeah. Can we really prevent enhancement through modification of the human genome from happening?
It's a very good question. If I had to say yes or no, I would say we can't. No, we can't prevent it. Should we try? I think so. maybe eventually it will be something we should say is acceptable to do. Certain kinds of enhancement are acceptable and maybe not others. And so we get into, it becomes effectively the same kind of argument as we might have about doping for competition, for athletic competition, or other kinds of performance where people are competing head to head. So when would it be acceptable versus not? It becomes less about safety, which I think is the arguments now are about, it's not a good enough reason to do something this risky. It's a good enough reason to do something that's risky to try to cure disease, but it's not something with a good enough reason to try to make somebody have a little more muscle mass, or try to improve their vision or something. But at some point, the technology may be developed and mature enough and understood well enough that we would say it's perfectly safe, and therefore it becomes more of a question of when is it acceptable to do and when is it not, that isn't about safety and efficacy, but rather about the social implications. And it becomes more like what we argue about related to world doping, the Russian Olympic team, right, banned from international competition because of longstanding attempts to dope. So it becomes more like that to me. But the short answer to the question is no, I don't think we can. That's going to be really, really hard to control. And it becomes a lot like other off-label uses of other medicines and therapies.
How do we solve ethical issues on that international scale by United Nations-like authority that countries may or may not follow? UN infamously controlled by a few states. What are the repercussions that companies could face?
This to me is the most important question, and one way the hardest one to answer, at least answer in a way that there's a good and obvious path forward. So it's true that there are some international agreements, about how we will and won't behave, but they tend to be about things like how many atomic bombs do we have, right? Things that are threats to the existence of the planet, where we want to agree as countries not to behave in ways that will lead to our mutual destruction. So it's bio warfare, chemical warfare, nuclear bombs. So that's the level of things at which we have international treaties. How many missiles we have, not do we use this biomedical technology. So there are not good examples. It's that's the point I'm trying to make for how to internationally govern and harmonize a biomedical technology. So it will largely need to be voluntary and kind of peer pressured, right? You need to join the community of countries that are behaving responsibly this way. And there need to be some kinds of real or perceived punishments for those who do not. Interestingly, the one that may have the most success and near-term sort of teeth is publication. As I said, the scientific community wants to publish in scientific journals. That's how they advance their careers. That's how they show what they're doing to their peers. And if they're not permitted to publish because they haven't followed rules, that's a big stick or a big carrot, depending how you think about it. But that's not about countries. That's just about, borderless kinds of governance. And so it's a good question about how we get something that looks more like harmonized policymaking across countries. The WHO is a UN body, right? So there are many countries that will follow it because they think it's important to follow WHO. Then there are many others, like mine, right? We are wanting to, we probably will go back and become a member of the WHO, but we don't tend to follow the WHO anyway, even when we're a member country. So I think it will be very challenging to do, but that's the work that I'm pretty deeply engaged in. And we're, in some sense, it's track 2 or track 3 kinds of discussion, where it isn't the governments talking, government to government, but it's the people who are not in the governments, but are at some level experts talking to each other.
Thank you. 2 last questions. The first one is, with the legal system being less educated than the research community, how can you expect it to support research which might be questionable? What would be the utopian scenario?
Well, so, and one thing to say about the legal process is not one that acts proactively. It reacts, right? It responds to things that are brought to it. So it's always a lagging kind of authority. It follows, it doesn't lead. And so that's just the nature of law, appropriately. So that's one problem. And the second, as the question indicates, there is a lack of expertise. I wouldn't say education so much as expertise in the science and the depth of science among the people who are charged with deciding about law. So there are efforts in the US, I don't know about as much elsewhere, to help educate judges about a leading edge science for exactly this reason. That said, it's a very imperfect place for these things to be decided, right? So law, at least the sense of law that I'm understanding the question to indicate, is not the right place. It's really regulation and policy, which is a part of law, but a very specific part of law.
Yeah, it's quite close. It seems we tend to deal with issues by repression or authorities. What alternative, more positive routes do you see in the field of ethics?
So I'm not exactly sure I get the question, but how to make ethics sort of part of policy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because actually at that point, it's actually you have the repression or authorities. And the question is, how could we make a positive move actually thanks to ethics or through ethics?
Yeah, that's the work I've spent my 30 years of my career trying to do. It's hard is the real answer. But it's interesting because sometimes ethics is viewed as the obstacle to science going forward. So that to me is part of that's not a healthy relationship. So one answer to the question is working together with the people who do science and the people who try to work on policy governing science to help do both responsibly. That's where ethics has a role to play. And to the extent ethics is viewed as kind of the police or an obstacle to science going forward, that isn't helpful, because then you will be always viewed as preventing rather than helping to steer in positive ways. So that to me is sort of the high level answer. How to actually do that, I think, requires a lot of work that you don't get paid to do as an academic. You're doing a lot of volunteer work, spending a lot of time on commissions and committees, and talking to a lot of people on the phone and in meetings. But that's, I think, a really valuable thing to work on. So I know you want to finish. I can see you're getting ready to say goodbye and thank you.
Yeah, I would like to say, first of all, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you for sharing with us, sharing those kind of concerns, very important for, of course, for our week, for our project, but more importantly, as a citizen, as human species, what's going on. Thank you so much for being with us today. Have a good day. Have a great year coming, and hope maybe we're going to have the chance to meet each other within the next months or years. Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.